"Papa, why don't you love us anymore?" The voice was small, barely above the hum of the engine, but it carved through the silence like glass. Heads turned. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The clink of a spoon on a tray paused in mid-air. A cabin full of strangers now held their breath, eyes shifting toward row 14. A little boy sat upright in his seat, his legs swinging gently, his stuffed bear tucked beneath one arm. His voice didn't shake. His eyes didn't flinch. He wasn't trying to make a scene. He was just asking a question that only children can ask with that kind of purity and devastation. 3 rows ahead, the man he had spoken to froze, not from fear, but from something colder, the sting of truth. He didn't turn around, didn't nod, didn't blink. He stared ahead, locked in place, as though pretending the boy had spoken to someone else. But everyone knew. Lucienne did too. She had tried to distract Eli with a snack, a story, anything, but children see more than we think. She felt her chest tighten as the truth echoed around the cabin, heavier with each second it was left unanswered. Across the aisle, a woman whispered to her husband. A man near the exit adjusted his glasses, pretending not to stare. A flight attendant stopped walking, holding a juice can mid-pour. The boy waited. Still, no answer. In that silence, something happened, not outside, but inside the man who once built empires. His shoulders sank. His jaw slackened. His hands, once steady and commanding, trembled just slightly in his lap. No boardroom could have prepared him for this. And you, watching now, maybe you've seen someone carry pride so tightly, they forget how to carry people. If you believe some people can change, if you believe second chances still matter, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and join this channel, where every story reminds us of the lessons that shape the heart. This moment, this impossible moment in a cabin 30,000 feet above the ground, was no accident. Let's go back to how it all began. Grant used to come home to laughter. Eli would run to the door, arms stretched wide, socks slipping on hardwood, shouting "Daddy's home!" with all the joy a child could fit into 3 words. Lucienne, radiant and worn from the day, would be in the kitchen, waiting with tired eyes and a smile that still believed in him. But somewhere along the line, Grant stopped noticing those smiles. The man who once kissed his wife's forehead every morning before checking his email had started waking up already inside his inbox. The man who used to race toy trucks on the carpet with his son now raced from one meeting to the next, checking his watch more than his child's eyes. He didn't scream. He didn't fight. He just left without leaving. Lucienne watched him vanish in pieces, a little more each day. Fewer shared dinners, fewer conversations, fewer words that held weight. She tried, again and again. One night, standing in the hallway as he loosened his tie, she whispered, "We're slipping away from you. Do you even see it happening?" Grant didn't argue. He didn't even sigh. He simply looked at her, not with anger but absence, and said, "I don't belong in this house anymore." That was the night Eli sat on the stairs, clutching his bear, listening. His father didn't even notice him there. He left 2 days later. No storm, no slamming doors, just silence, the kind that stretches across every room and stays long after the footsteps are gone. Lucienne stayed, for Eli's sake, for the sake of the walls that had once held love. But even she couldn't fight the silence forever. Lucienne had always been strong. Not loud, not forceful, but quietly unwavering. She held that home together with bedtime songs, whispered prayers, and the softness of routines that Grant never noticed slipping through his fingers. But even the strongest arms get tired when they're holding everything alone. It was the 5th morning Eli woke up asking if his father would be home today. It was the 2nd week Grant hadn't called, not once. It was the moment Lucienne stood in the doorway of their once shared bedroom and realized she no longer waited for footsteps. That was when she knew staying in that house was no longer an act of love. It was an echo. She packed slowly, not in anger, but with clarity. A few clothes, a toothbrush, Eli's bear, a book he liked to hear twice before bed. When she told her parents she was coming, her mother didn't ask why. Some silences explain themselves. At the airport, Eli held her hand without question. He was only 5, but there's a kind of knowing that lives in quiet children, the kind who watch the door more than they play, the kind who learn not to ask questions that make their mother cry. But just before they boarded, as they walked toward the gate, Eli looked up and asked softly, Will Papa be there too? Lucienne didn't answer. What could she say? She simply knelt, zipped up his jacket and said, "Let's get on the plane, sweetheart." There was a time when people stood the moment he entered a room. Not out of fear, but out of certainty. Certainty that decisions would be made. Certainty that profits would rise. Certainty that this man, Grant, would always find a way to stay 10 steps ahead of everyone else. His reputation wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. Executives described him as collected. Shareholders called him visionary. Clients trusted him because he didn't sell illusions, he sold results. In press interviews, his answers were crisp. His suits, always tailored. His voice, smooth and controlled. And when the photos were taken, his hands always rested in the same pose, folded neatly, knuckles touching, expression unreadable. The world mistook that control for peace. But the control was everything. Without it, Grant didn't know who he was. He built his wealth with quiet aggression, the kind that didn't slam doors but closed them with such finality, no one dared open them again. He led meetings like a conductor leads an orchestra. Minimal movement, maximum effect. But outside that polished world, he was fading. At home, Lucienne once joked that she had to book an appointment just to sit on the couch with him. Grant had laughed, but he didn't sit. It didn't happen all at once. Distance rarely does. First came the unread messages, then the skipped dinners. Later, the way he began looking past his wife during conversations, not with hostility, just with vacancy. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He just became less there. Lucienne would talk to him, and sometimes he'd nod, but it was the kind of nod people give when they're watching a screen, not listening to a soul. She began writing notes and leaving them in his briefcase. "Eli missed you at dinner. He asked if we could wait next time. You didn't see it, but he won the class award today. He was so proud. I miss the man who used to laugh when he got crumbs on his tie." Sometimes the notes came back, untouched. Other times, they were gone. No response, no comment, no recognition. People often talk about neglect like it's loud, like slammed doors and angry silences. But in Grant's home, it was quiet. It was the sound of a child asking the same question twice. The sound of Lucienne pouring 2 cups of coffee and one always going cold. The sound of footsteps that used to come upstairs after work and now stopped at the home office instead. Eli once drew a picture of their family for a school project. He colored himself and his mother standing in the yard. The third figure, the father, was on a phone. When the teacher asked if he wanted to draw a new version, Eli said, "That's what he looks like." At work, Grant's days were filled with numbers, pitches, strategy decks. He was solving crises for multinational clients. Fixing other people's chaos made him feel useful, made him feel less hollow. But when he came home, there was nothing to fix, only things to feel. And Grant didn't know how to do that anymore. Lucienne noticed it one night, sitting across from him during a rare dinner together. She was talking about Eli's bedtime story routine. Grant smiled and nodded, but his eyes were somewhere else, not in anger, not in frustration. Just gone. She stopped mid-sentence. "Where are you right now?" she asked gently. He blinked. "What do you mean?" "Because you're not here," she said, setting down her fork. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He just looked down at his plate and nodded again. She watched him become more stranger than spouse. She watched their child start asking permission to hug him. She watched herself become quieter at dinner, not out of submission, but from fatigue. At night, she would wake up and feel the space beside her, warm but still, not restless, not agitated, just completely still, as if he had learned to sleep without dreaming. And in the morning, the silence continued. Grant would leave early, always with the same phrase. "I've got an early one." One morning, Lucienne replied, "We haven't had a late one in weeks." He didn't respond. Lucienne wasn't naive. She knew marriage came in seasons, that not every day would be filled with laughter or softness. But this wasn't a season. This was a slow erasure. She tried everything that didn't make her beg. Dinner out, just the two of them. Notes in his coat pocket. Kisses at the door that lingered even when he didn't. She tried meeting him where he was, even if it meant sitting in silence next to his laptop while he typed. But you can only sit next to someone for so long before you start to wonder if you're just a chair in the room. It all came to a head on a Wednesday evening. Lucienne had waited until Eli was asleep. The quiet hour when words were less likely to become sharp, when a home is dim enough to make honesty feel safe. Grant came in late, shirt collar loose, tie stuffed in his coat pocket. His eyes looked as if they'd seen more spreadsheets than sunlight that day. She was waiting in the hallway, leaning against the doorframe like someone deciding whether to try one last time. "You missed bedtime again?" she said. He nodded, placing his keys on the table. There was a pitch review that ran over. She didn't raise her voice. He waited by the door. He fell asleep with his shoes on. Grant sighed lightly, not because he was annoyed, but because he didn't have the energy to respond with anything deeper. Lucienne took a step closer. "Do you even know how many nights you've missed this month?" He looked at her now, not defensive, not cold, just tired. "I'm doing the best I can." "No," she said. "You're doing the best you can out there, but in here, you're doing nothing." Silence stretched between them, and then he said it. Not cruelly, not like a man trying to hurt, but like someone stating a fact he had long since accepted. "I don't belong in this house anymore." Lucienne didn't cry. Not then. She just stood there, still, as if the walls had shifted and she needed to find her balance again. He walked past her, up the stairs, without another word. Eli, still half asleep, stirred in his room. Lucienne walked in, sat on the edge of his bed, and whispered something he didn't hear. Later that night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, realizing that the sound of the front door closing wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how quiet it had become even before he left. That was the last week they lived as a family. Grant didn't yell. He didn't break anything on his way out. He just started coming home less, and when he did, he moved like someone walking through someone else's house. Lucienne stopped asking him to stay. It felt beneath her now. She focused on Eli, on keeping his world steady even as hers tilted. She smiled at the breakfast table. She laughed during bath time. She held her son together while her own hands shook in private. And Grant? He moved on, or pretended to, but deep inside, he was not free. He carried the weight of leaving like an overpacked briefcase, polished on the outside, but dragging just beneath his grip. The house still smelled like cinnamon in the mornings. Lucienne kept the routine alive, even when her heart felt like it was moving through fog. Eli loved when she made warm toast with cinnamon and butter, the way Grant used to when they first moved in. She kept that tradition going, not because she wanted to pretend everything was normal, but because she didn't know what would happen if she stopped. She had become the keeper of balance, of rhythm, of softness. But even soft things can crack under the weight of what's missing. Eli had started asking harder questions. Why doesn't Papa eat breakfast with us anymore? Is Papa still mad at me? Why doesn't he come to tuck me in? Lucienne never had answers that made sense. And children know when adults are covering holes with smiles. She'd kiss the top of his head and say, "Papa's working," but the words tasted like paper in her mouth. Even Eli, barely 5, had stopped believing them. His drawings began to change. Once full of bright colors and 3 smiling faces, they were now 2 figures, in color and one in pencil, as if his father was fading right off the page. One afternoon, she found him kneeling by the front door, holding his little bear in one arm and his school backpack in the other. He was waiting silently. When she asked what he was doing, he said, "I thought maybe Papa forgot the code to the house." That night, Lucienne cried quietly in the laundry room, the only place Eli wouldn't hear her. Grant still stopped by sometimes. Not often. Just enough to make it unclear whether he'd truly left or was still deciding. But even when he was physically there, his presence felt distant. He would sit on the couch, scrolling through his phone, answering a call, nodding along while Eli showed him a drawing. Lucienne watched from the kitchen, her heart folding in on itself. It was like watching a man stand in a house that no longer recognized him, and yet still held his shadow in every corner. Sometimes after he left, she would sit in the quiet and trace her fingers along the grooves in the wooden table, remembering the nights they laughed so loud it made Eli giggle from his room. Now, the table was just where unpaid bills and untouched dinners went. She began to talk to herself more. Small things, whispered reminders, sentences that would have once been spoken, to Grant out loud. She said them anyway, into the air. "I'll order more detergent tomorrow. Eli's socks are getting too small. I wish you'd said something before you drifted." One night, as she folded laundry in silence, Eli walked in holding his favorite book. He held it out to her and said, "Papa doesn't read it anymore." Can you do the voices? Lucienne nodded. Her voice shook on the first page. Lucienne had once believed that love could survive absence, as long as there was still intention. But what she faced now wasn't distance. It was drift. Drift is quiet. Slow. It doesn't leave bruises. It leaves questions. She stopped checking her phone for messages from Grant, stopped setting a second plate at dinner, stopped pausing when she heard footsteps outside, hoping it was him. Because over time, hope doesn't just fade. It starts to feel foolish. Eli still asked, "Did Papa see my stars chart? Can he come to the school play? Is he still part of our family?" Lucienne answered gently, always gently. But some nights, when Eli was asleep and the dishes were drying on the rack, she would lean on the kitchen counter and let her shoulders fall. No one saw what she carried, so no one knew how heavy it had become. Even her reflection began to look unfamiliar. Her eyes held too much stillness. Her lips, once quick to smile, now pressed together more often than not. On the rare days Grant visited, Lucienne watched how Eli would light up the moment the door opened. The boy would rush over, words tumbling out of his mouth, eager to share stories Grant hadn't been there to witness. Sometimes Grant would listen. Sometimes he'd smile. But always, the moment ended too quickly. An email, a meeting, a "sorry, buddy, I need to take this." One afternoon, after another brief visit, Eli sat on the couch holding his coloring book. He didn't cry, but Lucienne could see the weight on his small shoulders. She sat beside him. "Is something wrong, sweetheart?" He looked down and said, "I think Papa is forgetting how to be Papa." Lucienne had no words for that. She just wrapped her arms around him and whispered, "I know." That evening, as Lucienne loaded the dishwasher, she realized she hadn't heard laughter in the house in weeks. Not real laughter. The kind that fills a room and lingers in the corners like warmth. The silence had taken over everything. Even the photos on the wall felt like they belonged to someone else's life. The last time Grant visited, he didn't even take off his shoes. He walked in, asked if Eli was home, handed over a bag of cookies from some overpriced bakery, and checked his phone while Lucienne answered. His eyes flicked up only once, long enough to say thanks when she mentioned Eli was napping. Lucienne stood in the doorway, watching him scroll. It wasn't hate she felt. It wasn't even disappointment anymore. It was distance. The kind of distance you stop trying to cross when you realize the other person has already set up a new life on the other side. He didn't look around the living room. Didn't ask how things were. Didn't ask how she was. She didn't offer anything either. It was quiet. Not angry. Not bitter. Just hollow. That night, Lucienne stood at the window long after he had gone. The house lights were off. Eli had fallen asleep with a book open on his chest. The hallway clock ticked with slow rhythm, a kind of stillness that reminded her how long it had been since anyone had asked her how she was holding up. She thought about the moment he had told her, "I don't belong in this house anymore." The words hadn't shouted, they had whispered, but their impact had been thunder. That sentence was still echoing, not because of its cruelty, but because of its certainty. Lucienne didn't try to change his mind anymore. There was no plea left in her, just clarity, and clarity doesn't need a reply. It only needs a decision. Eli had started sleeping closer to her, even on nights when she tucked him in his own bed. One night, as he curled beside her, he asked softly, "If Papa forgot us, can we remind him?" Lucienne blinked back the burn behind her eyes and pulled him close. "We've already reminded him, sweetheart. But sometimes grown-ups forget things they don't want to feel." The next morning, she looked around the house and realized something. It no longer felt like a home they were sharing. It felt like a place they were preserving, for a man who didn't know if he still belonged there. That was when she booked the flight. Not because she wanted to run, but because staying had become an act of pretending. And she couldn't pretend anymore. Have you ever watched someone walk away? Not with anger, but with silence. Not slamming doors. Not cruel words. Just leaving piece by piece until all that was left was space? Tell us in the comments below. Your story might be the one someone else needs to read. Lucienne had never liked packing, not even when it was for something good. It always felt like a quiet reckoning, a slow conversation between what's staying and what has to go. But this time, it wasn't clothes or toiletries that made her stop and stare. It was Eli's bear. It sat on the edge of his bed like it always did, worn, small, soft in the middle where he always held it. She reached for it, paused, then sat down beside it instead. For a moment, she just looked around the room. The stars on the ceiling, the corner bookshelf, the drawing taped to the closet door that said, "Us three." Except now, it was just us two. She packed light, only what they needed. A few shirts, pajamas, a storybook. Eli's snacks, no photos, no keepsakes, nothing that might make her hesitate. Her parents had offered to come to her, but Lucienne needed to leave. She needed new air, new rhythm, somewhere that didn't hold so many questions in the walls. The morning of the flight, Eli was quiet. He didn't resist when she woke him, didn't ask why they were leaving. He just sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing one eye, bear in hand, and said, "Can I bring him too?" Lucienne nodded. She brushed his hair gently, dressed him with calm movements, kissed his cheek twice. Everything in her body wanted to hold on to the moment, and everything in her spirit needed to get on that plane. They left the house just after sunrise. The sky was soft, muted, a day between storms, not the weather kind, but the kind that live in people. The airport was busy in that ordinary way. Parents juggling bags, loudspeaker announcements, the endless clatter of moving feet. Lucienne moved through it all like someone following a script. Tickets, security, boarding gate. She kept her voice steady, her expression calm, her hand always wrapped around Eli's. He looked up at her just before they boarded. And then came the question, will Papa be there too? Lucienne stopped walking. For a moment, the world kept moving, but she didn't. His face was curious. Not sad, not afraid, just open, the way only children can be. Lucienne crouched beside him, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. She opened her mouth, and nothing came. There was no script for this, no clever line, no motherly answer. So she said what little she could. "I don't think so, sweetheart." Eli looked down at his bear, then nodded. "Okay." But that single word, "okay," it held more weight than any tear could. The flight had been delayed by 40 minutes. Lucienne didn't mind. Waiting was familiar now. She was used to long silences and things not arriving when they should. Eli sat near the window, kicking his legs lightly, watching the runway as planes rolled past. He pressed his bear's paws to the glass like they were both trying to fly. Lucienne closed her eyes for a moment, just breathing. It was the first time she had sat down all day. She had no idea that just a few gates over, someone else was waiting too. Grant wasn't supposed to be there. Not on that flight. Not even in that city. But business had shifted again, and a client meeting was canceled last minute. He needed to clear his head, or at least leave town for a while. He booked the earliest flight available without checking where it landed. Just out. He didn't notice the boarding gate number. Didn't look up at the other passengers around him. His mind was elsewhere, the usual chaos of unread emails rescheduled, calls, and that gnawing emptiness that no success could ever silence. His seat assignment was in the middle of the plane, 3 rows from where Lucienne and Eli were already seated. Lucienne didn't see him at first. She was adjusting Eli's seatbelt, tucking his bear between them, trying to focus on the small tasks that help mothers breathe through the bigger things they can't fix. The flight attendants made their announcements. The engines hummed to life. Everything felt routine, until Eli sat up straighter and whispered, "Mama." She turned to him, expecting a bathroom request or a spilled snack, but his eyes weren't on her. They were locked on something, someone, a few steps down the aisle. She followed his gaze, and there he was. Grant, no suit, no tie, just a plain shirt, coat in hand, face worn and unfamiliar in its tiredness. Her heart stilled. She didn't move, didn't blink, didn't speak. Her entire body was frozen between disbelief and the ache of seeing someone she used to know. He hadn't seen them yet. He was focused on finding his seat, walking slowly, weighed down, not by luggage, but by something much heavier. He passed by them. 1 row, 2, and then he heard it. "Papa." It wasn't a scream. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the air and stopped time. Every row turned toward the small voice. Every conversation paused. Lucien's breath caught. Grant stopped walking. His back was to them, his head tilted slightly, as if the name had echoed from another lifetime. He didn't turn. He just stood there, still, suspended in that impossible moment. Eli waited, not with anger, Not with fear, just with hope. Lucienne's hand was already trembling before she reached for the seatbelt buckle. She tried to steady her breathing, tried to stay composed, but her eyes remained locked on Grant's back, the man who hadn't turned around, the man whose child had just called out to him across an entire plain, and yet still chose silence. She glanced at Eli. He looked confused, not hurt, not yet. His face held the kind of innocence that believes an answer is still coming. Lucienne's instinct kicked in. She reached for her son's hand and said softly, "Why don't we look out the window, But Eli wasn't listening. He kept watching the aisle, waiting. Grant took his seat a few rows ahead. He placed his coat on his lap, buckled his belt, and turned his face toward the window, even though there was nothing to see. His jaw was clenched. His hands were still, but inside, something was shaking. He had heard the voice. Of course he had. He could never mistake that voice, not even after weeks of distance. It rang in his ears louder than the engine's rumble. Papa? That one word, so simple, so complete, and so completely undeserved. Lucienne stared at the back of his seat. She could feel the heat behind her eyes rising, but she blinked it back. If she cried now, Eli would see. If she cracked now, the boy would carry it. She forced a smile. "Do you want your snack, baby?" Eli tilted his head. "Why didn't Papa say hi?" The words came out light, casual, but Lucienne felt the knife inside them. She reached for the bag of crackers, hands careful, tone steady. "Maybe he didn't hear you." Even Eli didn't believe that. He looked down, hugging his bear a little tighter, then said no. The flight crew moved through the aisles. Safety demonstrations began. Passengers shuffled and adjusted their trays. But near row 14, something hung heavier than air pressure. A woman sitting across the aisle had seen it all. She turned to Lucienne and gave a small, questioning glance, the kind that says, "Do you want me to say something?" Lucienne responded with a slight shake of her head. No, this was already too much. Eli sat quietly for a while. Then, mid-safety announcement, he whispered again, soft but not shy. "Do you think he still loves us?" Lucienne's chest tightened. She looked at her child, the small boy who still believed love could be forgotten and remembered like keys left in a drawer. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to say more. But her voice wouldn't come, so she kissed the side of his head, tucked his bear beside him, and said, "Let's just sit together right now, okay?" Eli nodded. He leaned into her arm and rested his head on her side. But his eyes, they stayed open. The plane lifted from the ground with a deep, steady push, but for Lucienne, the ascent felt slow, like every second in the air stretched longer than it should have. She stared straight ahead, trying not to look 3 rows forward, trying not to ask herself what kind of man could hear his child's voice and stay facing the window. Eli had gone quiet. That was never a good sign. He wasn't asleep, just still. That kind of stillness that only shows up when a child starts to understand something they're not old enough to name. Grant hadn't moved. Not a twitch. The window beside him reflected nothing but clouds and sunlight, but he kept staring like it held answers. Inside, he felt like a rope pulled too tight. His son had called to him, called with love, with openness, and he had done. The only thing he had learned to do when faced with feelings too big to hold. He turned away. He hadn't meant to. Not exactly. It wasn't a decision, it was a reaction, like a muscle trained over years to retreat from anything unpredictable. But now, that silence felt louder than anything he could have said. The man beside Grant, middle-aged, well-dressed, quiet, hadn't said a word, but his glance was sharp, short, measured. He didn't need to ask questions. The story had unfolded right there in the aisle. A child's voice, a man's refusal, a woman's frozen breath. People noticed. That's the thing about moments like this. They don't need a spotlight. They don't need volume. They only need truth, and truth always finds an audience. In row 14, Eli leaned his head against Lucienne's side, whispering softly, "Mama, if he didn't see us, why is he here?" Lucienne rubbed his back, slow and gentle. She didn't have an answer. So she said the one thing she knew was real, "I'm here." 2 rows behind them, an older woman reached into her purse, pulled out a pack of tissues, and quietly slid one across the aisle to Lucienne. No words, just kindness. Lucienne nodded in thanks, blinking fast. Not for herself, for Eli, for the kind of pain that doesn't arrive with noise, but with quiet, long shadows. Across the aisle, a teenage girl whispered to her mother. He didn't say anything to his kid. Her mother gave her a look, the kind meant to teach restraint, but even she couldn't hide the tightness in her jaw. Farther down the row, a man who had once worked in family law recognized the silence too well. He'd seen it in courtrooms, in visitation rooms, the ache of presence without participation. The plane hit a slight patch of turbulence, not enough to worry anyone, just enough to remind everyone where they were, 30,000 feet above the world, carrying more than just luggage. Lucienne closed her eyes for a moment, not to sleep, just to steady herself, because she knew the hardest part hadn't happened yet. It had been 20 minutes since takeoff. The cabin had settled, meals were being prepped. Passengers unwrapped earbuds and tilted their seats back. Conversations hummed around the cabin again, casual, surface level, forgettable. But not in row 14. There, the silence hadn't moved. It stayed wrapped around Lucienne and Eli like fog, light enough to see through, heavy enough to weigh down the chest. Lucienne stroked Eli's arm slowly. Her other hand rested in her lap, clenched so tightly her knuckles ached. Eli had said nothing since his last question. He didn't sleep. He didn't cry. He just waited. And then, just as the beverage cart rolled into their row, Eli sat up. He turned toward the aisle, then leaned slightly, just enough to catch the back of the man 3 rows ahead. His voice, soft but unwavering, returned. "Papa." Lucienne's eyes shot toward him, hand reaching instinctively. But Eli wasn't done. Not this time. His voice rose, not loud, but clear, honest, brave in the way only a child can be. "Papa, why don't you love us anymore?" The cabin froze. Again, but this time, no one looked away. The clink of ice stopped. The cart didn't move. Passengers turned one by one, not with judgment, but with a quiet kind of heartbreak, because they all heard it, not just the words, but the weight behind them. There was no performance in Eli's question, no rehearsed pain, just a small boy, speaking a truth too big for his age. Lucienne's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected it. Not like that, not so open, not so raw, not so final. She reached for him, hand on his back, whispering, "Eli, baby." But he didn't look at her. He just kept his gaze forward, waiting. 3 rows ahead, Grant's hands twitched in his lap. His ears burned. His throat tightened. His world, so carefully built, so methodically held together, was cracking in real time. He didn't move, not right away, but his shoulders. They sank, not in shame, in something worse, recognition. The man beside him turned slightly, but said nothing. He didn't need to. The question had done all the talking. From across the plane, a woman whispered, "God," under her breath. A couple near the back exchanged a glance, the kind only parents give when something cuts too close to home. The cabin didn't breathe, waiting, wondering, what kind of man hears that? And stays still? And then, slowly, almost unsure of himself, Grant stood. He gripped the seat in front of him as if steadying a body that wasn't used to being unguarded. He stepped into the aisle. His head turned. He met Eli's eyes. And for the first time since that boy had said Papa, Grant looked back. Grant stood in the aisle like a man who had forgotten how to move. He didn't rush, didn't perform, didn't try to fix the silence with words. He just stood there, looking at his son, the boy he hadn't held in weeks, the boy whose voice had just shattered the safe distance he'd been hiding behind. Eli didn't flinch. His question still hung in the air. "Papa, why don't you love us anymore?" It wasn't the kind of question that needed repeating. It was complete the first time. Passengers didn't return to their books. They didn't plug in their headphones or pretend not to hear. They watched. Not to intrude, not to judge, but because some moments pull people in without permission. Lucienne sat still, one arm wrapped around Eli, the other braced on. The armrest, like her body, was keeping her heart from falling forward. Her eyes were locked on Grant, but she didn't speak. This wasn't hers to interrupt. Grant took a slow breath. His lips parted, but nothing came. Not yet. He walked forward, 1 row, then another, until he reached them. He knelt. The floor felt cold, hard, real. And so did the moment. He met Eli's gaze head on, eyes that still held hope, eyes that hadn't turned away. Grant's hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to say. "I never stopped loving you," he said, voice low, uneven. "Not for 1 second." Lucien's jaw tightened. He turned to her, then back to Eli. "But I thought, if I couldn't be perfect, I didn't deserve to stay." Eli frowned, tilting his head. "You don't have to be perfect." That broke something in Grant, not with drama, not with noise, but with quiet, brutal truth. His shoulders folded inward. A sharp breath escaped his chest, one he hadn't realized he'd been holding for years. And his face, it cracked, his mouth twisted, his eyes filled, his chin dropped, and for the first time in a very long time, he cried. The sound of Grant's crying wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was bare, the kind of sound a man makes when years of hiding finally collapse in public. His hand moved forward, resting gently over Eli's knee. Not gripping, just there. Eli didn't pull away. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man blinked slowly and turned toward the window, his jaw tight. One row back, a woman quietly wiped a tear before her daughter could notice. The plane kept moving forward, but time, in that row, felt like it had stopped. Grant took a shaky breath. "I thought if I worked hard enough, if I gave you everything, the rest wouldn't matter." He glanced down, ashamed. "But I wasn't giving you what mattered most." His voice wavered again. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I didn't know how to face the version of me that couldn't balance both." Lucien's eyes flickered. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet, but it was something. Some small door inside her that hadn't closed completely. Eli looked confused, but curious. "You could have just asked Mama for help." Grant smiled, even through the ache. "I should have." He looked at Lucien now. His eyes held no strategy, no defense, just a man in pieces. "I should have stayed, not for duty, but for you, for both of you." Lucien swallowed hard. Years of late-night arguments, quiet disappointments, and unanswered questions boiled beneath her skin. But she didn't interrupt, because this wasn't about repairing the marriage, not yet. This was about truth. Grant continued, voice lower. "I used to think showing weakness made me a failure, that if I didn't have all the answers, I had no place in a family." He turned his gaze back to his son. "But now I see. Walking away was the biggest failure of all. The space between them wasn't filled with answers. Just air. Thick, warm, still." Lucien didn't speak right away. She kept her hand on Eli's shoulder, grounding both herself and him. Her eyes stayed on Grant. Not cold, not soft, just steady. "I begged you to stay," she said quietly. "Not because I needed perfection, but because I needed presence." Her voice didn't shake. It didn't rise, but it reached him. Grant nodded once, slowly. "I know. I used to think if I just tried hard enough, you'd remember what we had," she continued. "But what we had wasn't broken. You were just afraid of it needing you." That landed harder than anything she'd ever said to him before. Not cruel, just honest. Eli looked between them, his small hands gripping the bear tighter than before. "Are we still a family?" he asked. The question silenced them both. It wasn't about paperwork or promises. It was about identity, belonging. Lucien reached for his hand. "We are," she said. "No matter what happens next, you are never without a family." Grant's face crumbled again, not into sobs but into surrender. "I want to learn," he said. "Not fix. Just learn how to be someone you can look at without pain." Lucien breathed in, then looked out the window, not to avoid him, but to steady herself. "You don't get to make that promise here," she said. "Not just with words." She looked back at him. "If you want to be part of this story again, you'll have to write it, one day at a time." The moment didn't end with a hug, or a kiss, or a decision. It ended with stillness, with 3 people sitting in the same row, not as a complete family, but as people finally willing to feel the weight of what was lost, and what might still be found. Have you ever heard a child say something that changed everything? A single sentence that pierced through the noise and left you different? Share your story in the comments below. Someone out there may need to know they're not alone. The plane hummed beneath them, steady and smooth, a sharp contrast to the quiet storm unfolding in row 14. Grant was still kneeling. His son's question had broken him open. His confession had poured out. But now came the part no one prepares for, the silence after the truth. Lucienne hadn't moved. Eli sat tucked into her side, eyes still wide, but calmer now, as if something sacred had just happened, even if he didn't fully understand it. Grant finally spoke again. I thought I had to be perfect to be a good father. His voice was low, honest, like it had traveled a long road just to say that sentence. I thought if I couldn't give you the version of me I showed the world, you'd see through me, that I'd let you down before I even tried. He looked at Lucienne now. Really looked. I didn't know how to be needed without knowing what to do. Lucienne's eyes didn't soften. They stayed fixed on him, not with anger but with weight. She didn't speak, because what do you say to a man who left without fire, without noise, without one final door slam? You listen. That's what she did now. Grant turned slightly toward Eli. I never wanted you to think I left because of you. Eli blinked. Then why didn't you say goodbye? That one hurt. It hit harder than all the other words. I was scared, Grant said. I didn't want you to see me when I didn't have the answers, so I chose to disappear, like a coward. Lucienne's hand tensed around the edge of Eli's jacket. Still silent. The aisle was quiet now. Most passengers had turned away, giving what privacy they could. But every now and then someone glanced back, not to intrude, but because something real was happening. And real things, they hold gravity. Grant exhaled. I used to think if I made enough money, built the right reputation, gave you a life with everything I didn't have growing up, it would be enough. He shook his head slowly. But what's the point of a perfect life if you're not in it? Lucienne lowered her gaze, not to avoid him, but because she needed a second to breathe. Because the truth in that question, that final one, sounded too familiar. It was her question too. What's the point of trying to hold a home together if the person you're holding it for keeps choosing absence over effort? Grant leaned forward slightly. I still don't know how to fix this. Lucienne finally looked up, not with forgiveness, but with recognition. I didn't ask you to fix it, she said, her voice calm. I asked you to be in it. I didn't ask you to fix it, Lucienne repeated, her voice steadier now. I asked you to show up, even when you didn't have the answers, especially then. Grant nodded slowly, like the weight of her words had landed exactly where it needed to. I was afraid I'd mess it all up. You already did. Her tone wasn't sharp, but it didn't soften to spare him either. You don't get to vanish and call it protection. Grant's eyes dropped to the floor. He hadn't expected grace, but hearing the truth spoken, that clearly still cut deeper than anything he'd prepared for. I know. Lucienne leaned her head back slightly, staring at the seat in front of her. You used to be the one who said presence is louder than promises. I remember, he whispered. Then why did you go so quiet? For the first time since he knelt, Grant sat, right there on the floor between rows, cross-legged like someone in timeout. Not to posture, not to beg, just to stay. Lucienne watched him, not with judgment, but with the same expression you give someone handing you a fragile object, uncertain whether to reach for it or walk away. You left the table while we were still eating, she said. He looked up. You left the bedtime stories halfway through, the dinners, the garden we started. The calendar on the fridge still has your name on it. She turned her head slightly toward the window, blinking slow. You didn't just leave me with a broken marriage. You left me explaining to a child why love suddenly had a schedule. The words didn't raise their voices, but they rose in truth. Grant didn't respond right away. He took it in, all of it, the missed moments, the habits he abandoned, the rituals she kept alive alone, and the child sitting between them, who had learned to ask permission before getting excited, just in case it made someone uncomfortable. Eli looked up at them both. He wasn't crying, but his lips were pressed tightly together, like he was holding something inside, a question, a wish, a memory. Lucienne looked down at him and placed her palm over his heart. We're okay, she said softly. Then she turned to Grant. But you don't get to talk your way back in with tears and regrets. Grant nodded again. I don't expect to. Good. There was a long pause. Then Lucienne asked a question that neither of them had expected her to say aloud. Why now? He looked surprised. Why this flight? Why today? Why this moment to finally speak? Grant hesitated, then told the truth. "I wasn't flying to see you." Lucien raised an eyebrow. "Then, I was running again. Thought maybe going somewhere else would feel easier than sitting still in what I broke." He looked at Eli. "And then I saw you both, and it felt like the sky put me in a seat I could no longer walk away from." Lucien didn't reply right away. She looked at Grant, eyes tired but sharp, not hardened, just awake in a way they hadn't been in a long time. "You want to believe this was fate," she said. "That the plane, this moment, the seats, were all lined up for you." Grant stayed silent. She leaned forward slightly. "But maybe this wasn't about giving you a sign. Maybe this was just the first time you couldn't run fast enough." Her words weren't meant to wound. They were meant to root, to plant him in reality. He nodded again, a small one this time, as if accepting that truth without defense. Eli was dozing now, head against her arm, bare in his lap. His small breaths were soft and rhythmic, his grip loose but still there. Lucien looked down at him for a long while, then spoke. "You don't get back into our lives by showing up broken." Grant's breath caught slightly. "You get back in," she continued, "by showing up consistently, quietly, repeatedly, until we believe you're not just visiting the pieces." He took that in, didn't flinch, didn't push, just listened. And then he nodded. For the first time since he'd knelt beside that seat, Grant leaned back slightly, exhaled, and rested his hands on his knees. "I'm not asking to be forgiven today," he said. Lucien said nothing. "I'm just asking to still be standing when the next chance comes." There was a long silence. Not heavy, not empty, just space, finally honest. The plane began its slow descent. The captain's voice came through overhead. Passengers began to stir, stretch, gather their belongings. But in row 14, no one moved. Grant remained where he was. Eli slept soundly. Lucien stayed upright, still wrapped in that space between pain and possibility. And when she looked at Grant again, her face unreadable, she didn't speak, but her eyes, they held him, not as the man who left, not yet as the man she trusted, but as someone who had chosen not to walk away, even when staying cost him more. She nodded once, small, barely there, and Grant knew what it meant. Not forgiveness, not invitation, just witness. She had heard him. And for now, that was more than he had expected. The descent began gently. A soft ding overhead. The lights shifted. Tray tables clicked shut. Lucien reached for Eli's seatbelt and buckled it carefully, her fingers, brushing his tiny frame with the tenderness only a mother knows. Eli stirred, but didn't wake. He'd said enough for one flight, more than anyone had expected, more than Grant had ever deserved. Lucien pulled the small blanket tighter over his chest, then looked up, and there he was, still sitting on the floor, still quiet, still present. Grant didn't ask if he should move. He stayed where he was, not as a father demanding entry, not as a man chasing redemption, just still. No expectations, no final speech, no attempt to seal the moment with a solution. The flight attendants made their rounds. Someone asked Grant if he was okay kneeling there. He nodded once. That was enough. One of them offered water. He declined politely. Lucien said nothing, because there was nothing to say, yet. The plane tilted slightly as it descended through open skies. Outside, the world looked peaceful, but inside Lucien's chest, things were still rearranging. She'd always imagined this kind of moment, if it came, would be louder, angrier, final. But this wasn't closure. This was exposure. A man laid bare, a woman carrying the weight of clarity, and a child who had said the one thing no adult could. The seatbelt sign chimed again. Eli shifted in his sleep. Lucien pressed a kiss to his temple and looked at the man in front. Of her, the man who had once been her world, then her wound, and now, she wasn't sure what he was. The landing gear dropped beneath them with a dull mechanical thud. Grant looked up for the first time in minutes. His knees ached, his shoulders stiff, but he didn't move. Lucien's gaze met his briefly. It wasn't warm. It wasn't cold. It just existed. A glance with history in it. A glance that didn't need to explain itself. He took it as permission to sit up. Slowly, he rose from the floor, brushed off his hands, and eased into the empty seat across the aisle. Still near, still silent, Eli remained asleep, his breath calm now, peaceful in a way that almost felt undeserved. As the plane descended through the final stretch of sky, Lucienne leaned her head back and closed her eyes. She wasn't running the moment through her head like a film. She wasn't imagining what should have been said or what she wished had gone differently. She was simply trying to feel what was real and to admit, quietly to herself, that she didn't yet know what came next. Forgiveness wasn't a switch. Trust wasn't a doorway. Some things rebuild from the ground up, and even then, they don't always stand again. The captain's voice came overhead. They would be landing in less than 5 minutes. Passengers began preparing. Seats straightened, bags adjusted. Conversations resumed. But row 14 wasn't like the rest. Lucienne stayed still. Eli stayed quiet. Grant sat with his hands clasped and his mouth closed. Lucienne opened her eyes and turned her head toward the window. Her reflection stared back faintly. She barely recognized it, not because she looked different, but because, for the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was pretending, not fighting to hold something together, not shrinking to make space for disappointment, not chasing closure that wouldn't come, just breathing, just being. The wheels met the runway with a soft thud, not jarring, just enough to remind everyone they were back on solid ground, though nothing about the moment felt settled. Eli stirred as the brakes slowed the plane. He yawned, rubbed his eyes, and looked up. Lucienne smiled down at him, brushing a hand through his hair. "You okay?" He nodded, eyes still heavy with sleep. "Did we land?" "We did." His gaze drifted toward the aisle, and for a split second, he looked to see if Grant was still there. He was. Eli didn't say a word, neither did Grant. But for the first time, the space between them felt possible. Not fixed, not safe, but possible. Passengers stood, stretching limbs, reaching for bags. The chatter returned. The flight attendants smiled. The usual post-landing buzz filled the cabin. But Lucienne stayed seated. So did Grant. No rush, no conclusion. She reached for her purse. He reached for nothing. And when their eyes met again, just for a second, he gave a slight nod. Not a plea, not a request, just a man acknowledging, "I'm still here." Lucienne placed her hand on Eli's back and guided him into the aisle. Grant stood back, giving them room. He didn't follow. He didn't ask to walk with them. He just watched as mother and son moved toward the door. Lucienne stopped briefly before stepping out. She didn't look back, but she didn't walk faster either. That hesitation, 1 second long, was enough to make Grant breathe a little deeper, because she could have walked straight out without pause. But she didn't. The story doesn't end on the tarmac. There is no bow, no kiss, no reunion photo, just 3 people whose lives collided in the sky and quietly rearranged themselves in its stillness. Should Lucienne give him another chance? What would you do in her place? Would you open the door again or protect what's left? Comment below. Your answer might be the one someone else needs to see today. We all have someone we've emotionally abandoned, not through shouting, not through chaos, but through silence. Sometimes the loudest departures leave no sound behind, just absence that stretches across time, memories, and rooms that were once full of laughter. It's easy to believe that love is something you offer only when you feel whole. But wholeness is a moving target. And if we wait to feel ready, we'll miss the people who needed us when we weren't. There's a kind of heartbreak that doesn't come from betrayal or cruelty. It comes from being invisible to someone who was once your everything. And that pain, the slow ache of being unseen, often echoes longer than the loudest argument ever could. Lucienne never asked Grant to be flawless. She never needed him to be the man the world applauded. She just needed him to show up, to sit at the dinner table, to remember birthdays without reminders, to read one more bedtime story even after a long day. To be there, not perfect. Presence doesn't require grand gestures. It requires choice. The quiet decision to stay when walking away feels easier. To sit in discomfort. To be witnessed in your flaws and remain anyway. That's what Eli gave his father that day. Not judgment, not accusation, just a question. Why don't you love us anymore? Not screamed, not rehearsed, just spoken from the heart of a child who missed his dad. Some moments are mirrors. That question didn't just pierce Grant's heart, it reflected back the years. He had spent convincing himself that distance was the price of ambition. But the truth is, love that isn't felt doesn't grow. And silence isn't neutral. It's a slow unraveling of trust. He didn't have to be the richest man in the room. He just had to stay in the room. So, what now? We don't know if Lucien will let him back in. We don't know if Grant will keep showing up, even when it's hard. We don't know if Eli's question changed a moment or changed a life. But we do know this. He stayed on that plane. He knelt down. He let go of the mask. And for the first time in years, he chose to be seen. That matters. Because transformation doesn't always happen in grand finales. Sometimes it begins in the pause. In the moment between a question and an answer. To the one watching this right now, maybe you've left quietly. Not physically, but emotionally. Maybe someone is still wondering why you stopped tucking them in, stopped calling, stopped laughing the way you used to. Or maybe you're the one waiting for a knock that hasn't come, waiting for someone to notice you're no longer smiling, waiting for someone to ask how long you felt alone in the same room. Whoever you are in this story, you're not alone. This story isn't about a grand reunion. It's about the fragile, powerful choice to try again, to kneel, to listen, to be present. If this story touched you, give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more journeys like this, because sometimes stories are how we find our way back to each other.